Okay, kiddos, so we are finally in period five. So, for the next few weeks, many weeks, we are going to be talking about the time period between 1844 and 1877. So, let's start that time period with Unit 12 and Manifest Destiny. Hopefully, you remember that it was John O'Sullivan, a writer during the time period, that came up with the term manifest destiny. He wrote it for an article in which he was actually saying it was a bad thing and he was condemning Americans for doing so much damage as we moved west and expanded and stole things from people and killed people. And so he was condemning us, but somehow, some way it got turned around and manifest destiny became all these things you see in front of you. It became very romantic to move your family out west and to have all these great adventures. People wrote novels about it. It was very nationalistic. As a white American, you're going to take over the continent and make a bigger America. Of course, you can't forget the religious undertones. There's always that. We always use that as an excuse in history to take over people unlike us because we are sharing and spreading our faith. So, religious undertones were of course, a part of the day. You're going to take all these savages and give them the experience and of faith. And economic motivations, of course, are the ones we're going to be least likely to actually admit to, but they're really the driving force behind manifest destiny. So we are going to figure out where we got all these different areas here in America. You know a bunch of them already. You should know the 13 colonies, the Florida Treaty in 1819, the Treaty of Paris 1783, and the Louisiana Purchase 1803. So we're going to hit those a little bit in class. I'm not going to do it on the video, but we're going to do it in class just to kind of brush you up on it. But believe me, trust me, you have notes on all those places. So we're going to talk about them at a different time. So let's move on and figure out how we got these different areas you haven't learned about yet. We're going to start with that 49th parallel. So in 1818, we were debating with the British over where America stopped and started in this blue area that you see at the top of America. And so we ended up making a treaty with them that America would actually stop at the 49th parallel. And so it was President Monroe who did this, and he approached the British with two things. Number one, we want it to end at the 49th parallel. So that area in dispute is no longer going to be dispute. We end at the 49th parallel, and that's where Canada begins. In exchange for that, here's the second thing, we were willing to share the Oregon Territory, which there's really good soil there for farming. We will share it with the British for 10 years. Of course, that's a really dumb mistake, and we'll talk about that later. But make sure you know the two things that 1818 treaty offered, the 49th parallel and the British and America sharing Oregon Territory. So that area is now ours. Let's learn about the next one. So, Maine, you remember, was actually born out of Massachusetts. Missouri wanted to come in as a slave state, and America got upset, and so we created Maine as a free state in order to keep that balance between the free and slave states. And so Maine was created. But the problem is that we had never really decided where Maine ended and Canada began, or British territory. And so by 1837, Americans and Canadians had joined forces against the British, and we weren't at war, but we were messing with each other over that line, kind of having these arguments and little rebellions here and there. And so things got kind of tense. And in 1837, it's all going to come to a head when a British ship was boarded. Sorry, an American ship named the Caroline was boarded by a British group in American waters. And so the British, for whatever reason, nobody really knows why this came to be, but the British decided to board the ship, the Caroline, and remove the entire crew. And so most of the crew went willingly. There was a single black man that, for whatever reason, refused to just leave. And so there was a scuffle, and he was hit. He fell and he hit his head, and the blow when he fell was enough that it killed him. So it wasn't a murder, really, it was an accidental death. So this one guy gets killed. And if it had just been that, this one accidental death, it might not have been such a big deal. But after removing the crew, the British decided that wasn't enough, that they would actually burn the ship down. So they caught it on fire, burned it, and as it was burning, they allowed it to sail itself over the Niagara Falls, and of course, splinter into a million pieces. And so that just seemed like really barbaric to do it that way. And so when the media got a hold of this, it became a bigger and bigger and bigger thing. And it ended up focusing on that one guy that got killed. And every time that it was published, the story was published, the death toll rose. And so suddenly it wasn't one little guy, it was 10, and then it was 20, and then it was 100. And of course, the story always ended with this, then they set it on fire and they sent it over the Niagara Falls. And America was getting really upset about this because, the lie got bigger and bigger and people got more and more and more upset. And so there ended up being a retaliation for this. The Canadians and the Americans joined together, and when a British ship ended up sailing into American waters, they boarded that ship, removed the crew, and burned the ship to the ground. And that ship was the Sir Robert Peel. Now, there was no Niagara Falls where they were at to send it over, but it's still, now you've got these even more stressful feelings between all these countries, and America and Britain started to worry that there was going to be another war. And so President Martin Van Buren didn't do much else other than this, but he did send his Secretary of State Daniel Webster, and King George IV sent Lord Ashburton, and these men met in an undisclosed place to figure out the boundary line of Maine, and they were given full disclosure on everything that was going on, and these two men were allowed to create the treaty themselves, with the promise that they would each be fair to their own country and to the other country. And so the treaty that came out of it is named for them, Webster Ashburton Treaty of 1842, and it set that boundary of exactly where Maine is, and I'll show you that in a picture in a minute. But it also, I want you to know this too, it also created something called the Caroline test, where it became okay for a ship to sink another ship that they feel is a threat to them. So if you sink a ship, it the outcome has to be that that other ship has to pass that Caroline test, that they did something to threaten your own crew and make you feel like you had to sink their ship. So we're always supposed to use the Caroline ship or Caroline test to see if it's okay to sink somebody else's ship. It's not going to work, but it looked good on paper, it sounded good in the treaty, and so we're still supposed to use that Caroline test. So here you can see all the land that we ended up getting to be part of Maine. It's quite a bit. And that was quite an area that was disputed. And so we get that line in 1842, and Maine is finally officially a specific location on the world map. So now you have that top area, the 1818 treaty, and the other top area, teeny tiny 1842 Webster Ashburton Treaty. So you've got these teeny tiny spaces. So now you have 6 territories. You know the story behind. But let's go to another really big one. Let's go to Texas, 1845. So, if you recall, Mexico got her independence from Spain in 1823 because of the efforts of a man by the name of Father Miguel Hidalgo. Remember that? The cry of Dolores and how bloody his death was. Whole other story. So, 1820s to 1830s, Stephen Austin is the American who will go in and settle a very large portion of Mexico, and that portion ends up being Texas. So, why would the Mexicans allow an American citizen to come in and settle an area that big? Very good question. The answer is because there were a lot of hostile Indians in that area above Texas. And so, if you have a bunch of Americans there, they can act as a buffer zone between the Indians and the Mexicans. And so, part of the deal was that Stephen Austin and the people living in Texas would keep the Indians from filtering through and going into onto Mexican soil and causing problems down there. So it benefited everybody. But of course, the Mexicans are not going to allow Americans to just be there with no kind of rules whatsoever. It is Mexico, it's Mexican territory. So the Americans didn't like the way that the Mexicans were running the area. For one thing, they were forcing the Americans to be Catholic because Mexico was very Catholic and you're living on Mexican soil. And so they were adamant that all Americans living there had to turn to Catholicism. Well, no Americans want to be told what religion they are. That's why a lot of people came to America because they wanted to be a different religion. So that did not go over very well. If you wanted any kind of rights whatsoever in Texas at the time, you had to be a Mexican citizen. And it was really hard to get Mexican citizenship if you were an American. And of course, you would have to give up your American citizenship. And so basically, that meant that Americans living on Mexican soil had no rights whatsoever. Of course, they didn't. They're foreigners. But the Americans were not happy about it, and so things became more and more and more tense between the Americans living on Mexican soil and the Mexican government. So Sam Houston visits Mexico City in 1831, and there he meets the Mexican leader, the dictator named Santa Anna. Don't think he's mean and nasty just because he has a title dictator. That simply means he ruled by himself. But Santa Anna was willing to meet with Austin, didn't like what Austin had to say, and so he arrested him and put him in jail. And the only way that Austin could get out was to agree to some new rules. Not just the first two, they still stay intact, but here's some new rules that Austin's going to have to take back to the people of Texas and get them to agree to. Number one, the borders are closed, which means no more Americans on Mexican soil. That would be bad enough unto itself, but you have to remember that you had some men that had come into the area of Texas on Mexican soil and was making homes for their families, and then they would send for their families later. So if you close the border, that means you've now separated these families. At one point, believe it or not, Santa Anna was trying to figure out how to build a wall to keep Americans off of Mexican soil. Isn't that funny? Things do change, don't they? Second thing is no slavery was going to be allowed anymore on Mexican soil. But these Americans that had come into the area of Texas brought slaves with them because a lot of them wanted to have large farms and they needed people to work it. And there weren't enough people out west, or especially in the area of Texas because it's hot and dry. There weren't a lot of people there to work farms, and so they kind of needed those slaves. They also decided that the Mexican government did that they would charge taxes on imported goods, especially goods coming out of America. So Americans did not like the idea that they were going to pay higher taxes on American goods. So, but you got to see like that isn't irrational. You are getting goods from a foreign nation. Doesn't matter if you're from that nation, you're not living in that nation anymore. You are living in Mexico. But the Americans didn't like it. And so by 1835, both sides had had enough of each other and war will officially begin. So let's see some of the main characters that are going to be involved in the Texas Revolution. So let's start with Sam Houston. Sam Houston was a pretty famous guy at the time. He earned his fame by working side by side with Jackson when they were both soldiers in the military. And most of his fame came from doing bad things to the Creeks, like killing a bunch of them at Horseshoe Bend alongside Jackson. His early life, other than being a good friend of Jackson and work and fighting alongside him, we don't really know a whole lot about his personal life. We do know that he had a white woman as his wife, and she sued for divorce on the grounds of abuse. But we don't know really what to the extent of it. We can guess that he probably beat the crap out of her because this is a time period where women very seldom sued for divorce. And even if they did try and sue for it, the judges wouldn't give it to them. So, our guesses as historians is that it must have been pretty bad for a judge to say, okay, you have your freedom from this man because he is so violent. So, probably it was pretty bad. But we don't know that for sure. Anyway, Sam Houston will get this divorce and he moves from the East Coast to the area just above Texas. And he actually marries a Cherokee woman. And they have this little dry goods store. And so he crosses the line between America and Mexico quite a bit because he trades with these people. Supposedly, once he lived among the natives, his drinking got even worse, and the natives actually called him Big Drunk. He was an alcoholic. And apparently he was a mean alcoholic. But anyway, he's married to this Cherokee woman. He is famous already. And so when the Texas War for Independence broke out, Sam was the only one in the area that had any military leadership experience. And so he was immediately asked, will you help us? He said yes. So he knows the numbers are not good. There's, excuse me, there's less than 1,000 people willing to fight on the American side, but Mexico had 4,500 men. So Sam's idea, very first idea, was that we need a diversion. We need a way to divert the attention of this giant Mexican army, 4,500 of them. That diversion is going to be this, the Alamo. So originally, the Alamo was a Spanish Catholic mission, but the Mexican government allowed American settlers to use this. It was kind of a tiny town unto itself, but because it was walled off, it was a perfect place to lure the Mexican military and keep them busy. And so it was definitely a suicide mission, absolutely. But they did it for two reasons. They, like I said, Sam said they need a diversion. They've got to have something to keep the Mexican military in Santa Ana busy. Secondly, they needed to find a way to actually split the army, not just divert their attention, but split them. And so they made some pretty nasty threats to Santa Ana, got him to come to the Alamo. He comes with 3,000 troops. So now remember they started with 45. There's 4,500 Mexican men fighting for Santa Ana. 3,000 of them will show up at the Alamo. So they definitely did split them. In the end, they're only going to lose about 600 men. So that's pretty daggone good looking at the numbers, how they're skewed. It's 3,000 versus 185 men. On the American side, it was women and children too. And you've got 600 a loss of 600 men. So that's pretty good. But anyway, when Santa Anna realizes, look, this is going to come to a head, and we're going to have to start firing on this mission, he says to the men inside, please let your women and children go. This is ridiculous to sacrifice your women and children. And so he promises that if they open the gates and to let the women and children out, he will not allow his men to hurt the women and children or to enter the Alamo, that it will kind of just be everybody will stand down and let the women and children go and find their freedom. And so it's decided by the people inside the Alamo that they will allow the women and children to go. Santa Anna is true to his word. The gates open, the women and children leave. They're not hurt. They're allowed to just walk away. So once that's done, Santa Anna asked the American men and some women and children that wouldn't leave, still behind the walls of the Alamo, won't you leave too? Like, come on, let's not do this. You know it's a suicide mission. I'm willing to let you walk. And none of them would do it. And so he screams, "De Gallo." Sorry, I know I'm not good at Spanish, but you see the word here. And that basically means kill them all. So the war is on. Two most famous guys inside the walls of the Alamo is James Bowie. He's super famous as a frontiersman back then, and you might have heard of a Bowie knife. That was him. He's the one that invented this giant, giant knife that could like gut a whale. That was James Bowie. So he was inside, and so was William Travis. Now, they have 185 untrained fighters. Even James and William they're good frontiersmen, they're good hunters, but they're not fighters. And they still ended up holding off this giant Mexican army of 3,000 men for 13 days. So, in the end, of course, they will be completely overrun. And out of the 185 people inside the Alamo, the Americans inside, only two will survive. So they lost 183. Those that survived, one was a woman who refused to leave her husband and sons, who were all killed inside. The other was a small slave boy who had hidden under a wagon during the entire thing, and he only snuck out occasionally to steal some food, and then he would hide back under the wagon. So he ends up surviving. So James Bowie and William Travis. James Bowie got the flu. What a time to get the flu, right? But he got it really bad. I mean, the kind of flu where you've got something coming out of you at one end all the time. And so he was bedridden basically through most of this 13-day battle. And supposedly, according to the stories, he had a bucket beside his bed so that he could throw up in it. And he sat up to get to the bucket to throw up, and a stray bullet went through the wall, got him, and killed him in his bed. So he misses pretty much the entire fight. William Travis is one of the last to die, and according to the legend of the Alamo, he climbed to the highest wall and was basically screaming at them, come get me, you can't get me, you can't kill me." And so they killed him. They filled him with holes, and that was the end of William Travis. But the ultimate legacy of the Alamo is that it absolutely fulfilled its mission. It did create a diversion that kept Santa Anna busy. Now, he'll leave towards the end of the 13 days, so he's not there for the entire thing, but it does a pretty good job of diverting his attention so Sam Houston can be, like out in the wild blue yonder looking for more people that will help. And it does split the military, the Mexican military. So remember, we still have 1,500 guys out there. By the time the Alamo is over, Santa Anna has joined his last 1,500 men. And so the diversion and the split does work. And here is a picture of the Alamo. You can see on the far left, William Travis was killed on the staircase screaming, come get me, come get me. And by golly, they came and got him. It's not a huge place, but it was kind of a town unto itself. You can see it had a well, a hospital, a plaza, a jail, infantry barracks, homes. It had all this stuff, even a chapel. So it was like a home or a little city unto itself. Very little, but a city. So anyway, the final battle is going to take place in a city called San Jacinto, and so that final battle, Santa Anna is there, and he is telling the 1,500 troops, what has taken place at the same time that Sam Houston has collected 800 Texans to come in and help him. And he screams at them the entire time, remember the Alamo, to get them all riled up against the Mexican military. And it works. Um, but they kind of sit back, Sam Houston and his 800 men, and say, how can we do this with the least number of kills on either side? We're not here to murder Mexicans. We just want our independence. And so it is decided that they will infiltrate the Mexican military unit during siesta time when everybody's taking a nap. And so they do. Sam sneaks right in, kidnaps Santa Anna, and he says, if you want to live, you need to sign this treaty. And so Santa Anna does. So the Mexicans are defeated. Santa Anna signs the Treaty of Velasco in 1836, and suddenly we have an independent Texas. So Sam Houston will be the president of Texas. It is a country unto itself. Stephen Austin is made the Secretary of State. And in 1838, Texas asked Jackson to annex them. Now, Sam Houston, being friends with Jackson, thought that Jackson would say yes, but he did not. This is Jackson's first year as president, and he was worried about upsetting that balance of free and slave states. You've heard that story before, and so he said no. And so for 9 very long years, Texas is a Lone Star state. It's really actually a country, but they call themselves a Lone Star state, so they're kind of out in the wind, nobody there to help them until 1845 when President Polk finally annexes Texas and makes her a state. Polk, by the way, is the president that gets the most new land for America. I know the Louisiana Territory was huge and Jefferson got that for us, but Polk, when you add up all the land acquisitions under him, it's even bigger than that. So he started with Texas, and we'll talk more about the other places that he got us. But make sure you know 9 years Lone Star State, and it was finally annexed under Polk. So now you have another big giant place. So we only have three places left to go. So let's get to it. We're going to begin with the Oregon Territory. So remember, 1818, that treaty, we agreed to have a joint occupation with England for 10 years. Big mistake. You never want to share land. But it actually is going to go on for more than 10 years. The British don't want to let go of it. And it's not going to be a giant, giant problem until about 1843. Now, in 1843, there was a married couple by the name of Whitman, a husband and wife doctor team. And they came to an area in Oregon called the Willamette Valley, and they were going to help the Indians there with medical attention. So the Whitmans were good people. They brought 11 other doctors, nurses, medical type people with them, and they were going to again help these Indians. Well, a large number of Indians ended up dying, over 200 of them. And we do not know all the circumstances, but the Whitmans and the 11 people that were with them were accused by the Indian tribes of purposely murdering these Indians by poisoning them. Now, did they? We don't know. We don't know what killed those Indians. It could have been some kind of a plague. We don't know what killed them. It could be that maybe smallpox just hit really, really hard, really, really fast. Or maybe the Whitmans really did. But I don't know. Why would they travel all the way across the country to settle in Oregon to just kill 200 Indians? None of it makes any sense. But the Indian tribe truly believed that the Whitmans and their helpers had purposely killed 200 people, and so they brutally murdered the Whitmans and their medical party, and it became known as the Walla Walla Massacre. So people in Oregon were begging America, please, please make us a state, make us a state. And we couldn't because were sharing it with Britain. So we kept telling them, we'll see what we can do. We'll see what we can do. But then somebody discovered gold in Oregon. And so now you have a large group of people that meet the numerical qualification to become a state, and they want to be a state. You've got really fertile land in Oregon. That's why Britain wanted it. And now you have gold. Heck yeah, President Polk's going to jump right on that, and he creates this slogan called 5440 or fight. That's the latitude line that he wanted. He wanted Oregon to go all the way up to 5440, and he wanted Britain out of it, and he was going to fight if he didn't get that. And so if you look at the line, I'm going to show you a map in just a minute. If you look at that 5440 line, that would have put us right up against where Russia was sitting. So it would have made Britain mad at us for kicking them out, and they would have lost a very large chunk if we had gone all the way to 5440. And we would have had to probably contend with the Russians as well. So Britain comes back with this compromise. We can't give you the 5440, but how about the 49th? Just like we did with you in that undisputed territory before, we're going to set Oregon at the 49th. America will have a nice flat line at the top, very clear distinction on where America ends and Canada or British territory begins. And so Polk said yes. So Polk also got us Oregon. And so here's the line. You can see the 49th parallel, which is what we ended up getting, but you can see what Polk actually wanted. He wanted all the way up to 5440, which is right there at Russia. So probably for us, it was a better idea that we did not get all the way to 5440, because it could have been a whole different history for us if we had tried to go against the Russians back in this time period in the 1840s. So we are stopped at the 49th parallel, but it's still a giant chunk of land that, again, Polk got us this. So he got us Texas, and now he gets us Oregon, kicks the British out. So now we only have the Mexican Cession and the Gadsden Purchase to go. Boy, you guys you just know it all. You're just smart as can be. Let's keep going. So we got to talk about how people got to this new territory, once they become a state, people are going to want to go out there because of the gold. But more, I know you guys have heard about the gold rush in California. It's not a real rush for Oregon. It's not gold as in chunks, it's gold dust. So it's not a massive wave of people that are going to head to Oregon. But there is a pretty large group. People want to go there to because it's good farming land, and so it's a brand new state. So again, manifest destiny, and it's romantic, and it's nationalistic, and all this other stuff. So they create a actual trail we call the Oregon Trail, and people were using it approximately from 1841 to 1869. It's about 2,170 miles long, and you can see how many wagons must have gone on this path. That's rock that you're looking at there. And there were so many wagons traveling on it that it actually chiseled out the rock. And so you can see this path. In some places, the trenches on either side where the wheels were so deep that the bottom of your wagon would actually drag on that center of that road. So it was a very well traveled road called the Oregon Trail. And here you can see where it went, the 2,170 miles. It's from Independence, Missouri. That's the what we call the jumping off point that most people from the east went to. It was a great place to get supplies, to get guides, and so most people, if you were going to travel the Oregon Trail, you went to Independence, Missouri, and used that as your jumping point or your starting point. Okay, so make sure you know that Independence, Missouri. So let's learn a little bit more about the trail itself. You needed about $1,000 to start your trip. Today it would be what you see in front of you, almost $27,000, but you needed all of that. You needed that to buy your goods. Most people walked the entire thing because you were putting your everything you owned, every personal thing you owned in those wagons to get them across the country, and so you walked. And it was estimated that people who walked the entire trail went through about 10 pairs of shoes. They also ended up doing something kind of smart. There were lots of wagon trains out there, and there was the thought or the fear that you might get mixed up with one another, and you had a guide that knew where to go and how to get there and all that. And if you got mixed up with another group, you might end up someplace completely totally different. And so groups started painting their wagons alike one another, and it might only be the wagon wheel, like you see here, the wagon wheels were bright yellow, or they might paint an insignia on the side of the wagon, but very often you saw wagons that were painted unique in some way or another, so they knew who belonged to who. Now, even though the Oregon Trail was well used, that doesn't mean that it was an easy path. I mean, you saw how deep the ruts were, and that was a good part of the trail, but there were times where you had to have enough people with you to pull a wagon. Like the horses couldn't do it. You needed people that were pulling these wagons up. Maybe the horses couldn't get up there because it was too slippery. And you see that you've got all the wagons at the bottom, and they're bringing them up one at a time. That's realistic. That really did happen. There's also safety in numbers, definitely. You might have to do something crazy like build a raft there on the shoreline to get your belongings across the water, and you need people that can get the horses, pull the horses across if the water is too deep and you actually have to like pull them behind. So definitely safety in numbers. So having a wagon train was the way that most people traveled. Now, you heard silly stories about there was one guy that supposedly walked the entire trail by himself with nothing more than a wheelbarrow. Everything he owned was in the wheelbarrow. There was another guy who supposedly got inside of a big rain barrel, and he rolled himself all the way across the Oregon Trail. Now, are those stories true? Who knows? I mean, there's always going to be somebody that does something silly. If you run the Apple Blossom race around here, you'll see a guy that runs barefoot and a guy that runs dressed like a gorilla. There's always weird people in everything that you do. And so could there have been a guy who rolled himself all the way down the Oregon Trail? Sure, sure, but he was probably pretty sick and dizzy by the time he got there, right? So, what is even the point of that? Anyway, let's move on. Now, there were inventions that came about because of the trail, and one of them is bloomers for the ladies, because for the first time, there's going to be a reason that you may have to lift your dress up in public, God forbid. And so sometimes it might just be because it's so hot, or you might actually be climbing up a hill cliff, a mountain cliff. You can't do it in a dress. You're going to have to tie your dress pretty much around your neck. And so they came up with the idea of bloomers. It is the very first underwear really for women, and they were long pants really is what they were back then, but you wore them under your dress, and now it's okay to tie your dress up if it's too hot and you can get a breeze, great things like that. The first frisbees were also invented on the trail. Kids did this, and you may not know this, but cow dung and buffalo dung, when it dries, it dries almost in a perfect circle, and it does not smell when it's dried, believe it or not, it doesn't. And so kids started picking these hard circles up and throwing them like frisbees, and adults realized that you could also use it to burn, and it burns for a very long time, and again it does not smell. So the first frisbees, and the first time that dung in America is used as fuel for a fire. They also created the very first written telegraphs during this time period, and it basically was people writing on stone. And here's a picture of that. So people would leave messages for family members or friends that they knew were coming behind them. We made it here on this date. They might include people that they lost along the trail, where they're buried, whether you should make a right or a left, all that kind of stuff. But it became the first written telegraph across the country in America. Some of that's still there today, by the way. So one day I'm going to walk this trail, and I hope you guys all walk it with me. It'll be an adventure of a lifetime. So let's look at some of the social aspects. Children, for the first time in American society, are basically left to fend for themselves completely. You might go days and not see your child because you're worried about keeping your belongings safe, keeping the horses fed. If you're bringing any kind of livestock with you, you're worried about that. And kids are just expected to do the right thing and to stay with the wagons. And most kids do have to walk. And so, did some kids wander off never to be seen again? Absolutely. Kids also lost their manners. They started being independent and not listening to mom and dad. And so it changes the way that children are looked at and the way that children look at their parents. They had many cases where people, as part of their wagon train, people are going to get sick or injured and they're going to die. So they would bury them along the trail somewhere and let the wagons roll across them, so that the wolves and other wild animals wouldn't dig them up. But you didn't want to just leave somebody on the side of the trail to die. Sometimes it might take hours for somebody to die. So the whole group would get together and elect someone to be the watcher that had to stay behind and wait for this person to pass. So there are stories of watchers getting afraid that they're too far behind and they're never going to get caught back up, or maybe they're afraid of the dark and don't want to spend the night out there with a dying person. And so there are times that people said that the watcher would actually humanely as possibly kill this dying person, just to get it done and over with. Now, lots of people would make money on this trail, and they would travel the trail with extra supplies of something and sell it to people at outrageous prices. And one of the things was water, of course, and the most expensive glass of water ever sold on the Oregon Trail sold for $1,000. Big time money, right? There also, because the death rate was pretty high on the trail, and you didn't you didn't have a home that you could go to and kind of remember the person that you lost. You don't have homes, you're on the trail. So people were afraid of losing their memories about these people that die along the trail. And so they started doing something kind of creepy. They started taking pictures of the dead. And for a while, this will be a phenomenon in America where a lot of families do that. They do family portraits even. with the whole family gathered together with the dead person, which would be bad enough, but in many cases they posed that dead person to make them look like they were still alive, glued their eyes open and posed them. I know it's weird, but I'm going to show you some examples because you know I love weird stuff. So let's see. Can you figure out who's dead in this picture? No, it's not the little girl that's glowing in the middle and looks like an angel. It's the mom. If you look at her really closely, look at her hands. Her hands are very stiff. They're not bent at all. And doesn't she look surprised? So it's the mom. Mom again in this one. Doesn't she look really happy to be there? And the kids look really happy to be there too. Look at the one little blonde girl. Like, I'm not touching her. I'll just lean against her. I'm not touching her. Now, on this one, it's pretty obvious. You can see the man down on the ground. He has passed. He looks like he's starved to death. But you actually got a kid sitting with him. And again, the mom. That one's pretty obvious. This one is the daughter in the first picture on the left hand side. She has passed from some kind of illness, and so mom and dad posed with her. The one on the did I say left? I hope I did. On the right hand side, you see two little sisters, and the one with her eyes closed is the one that is dead. But they did that to siblings a lot. Go sit with your dead brother and sister. I don't know. I don't know. Talk about messing somebody up. And in this one, this is actually Tsar Nicholas, the last Tsar of Russia. And that's I just put this in here because I wanted you to see that it spread across the world. It starts in America, but it spreads across the world. And the person who is passed in this picture is the baby boy sitting in the middle. That is not Alexei. If you had me before, you probably hopefully remember the story that she had five sons total and four of them died. And so this is one of those four that the family posed with. So we can't talk about traveling west for settlement without going through the story of the Donners and the Reeds. So these are two separate families, both from Illinois. They did not know each other in Illinois, but when they get to Independence, Missouri, they end up meeting and becoming fast friends. So James Reed was actually pretty well known. His name was well known. He was a soldier. He actually served with Abraham Lincoln at one time. Lincoln was a terrible soldier, but he did actually personally know Abraham Lincoln. They had served together. But anyway, James Reed was a very trusted figure, and Jacob and George Donner knew of his reputation, met him in person, really liked him, and so James Reed met up with this guy with the last name of Hastings. And Hastings convinces James Reed that he has a much quicker path to travel through the Sierra Nevada mountains, that it is a much quicker way to get to California, and it'll cut, a month off. And so Hastings seems really reliable. He convinces James Reed to follow this map that he draws out, and then James Reed in turn goes to Jacob and George Donner and convinces them to leave with them. And so they all leave together. There are 12 families in total, 89 people. 40 of those people were under 14. So you had a very young group here. And James Reed kind of gave the leadership over to the Donner brothers. For whatever reason. The Donner brothers are the ones that kind of mapped it out, decided when they would rest, how many hours each day they would travel, stuff like that. In total, they had 20 wagons the day that they left Independence, Missouri. Now, here's a curious thing about when they left. Families or any traveler left Independence, Missouri usually by mid-April. The very latest you ever wanted to leave was that beginning of the last week of April, and that was really you cutting it close. These people that traveled through the Sierra Nevadas were on a very strict schedule because the winters there are so terrible, and so you were not supposed to leave past April. But these guys, for some reason, and we're not really sure why, didn't leave until May 12th. They were the last wagon train out in 1846, the last ones by far, and so it kind of set the path of their entire trip, leaving so late. So again, it's a very rough road. The safest months to travel is July through October. Um, and again, don't forget that they left at least 2 weeks too late. Even during July, between the months of July and October, very often you had record snowfalls. So, in an area that you're talking 800 inches of snow a year, this is a place you do not mess with. So, you see in the upper left hand side, there are three very distinct trails that many people use. So, you got the Oregon Trail, the most used, the California Trail, and the Mormon Trail. So these are pretty clear cut paths, but you can see on the bottom map here on the right, there's a little tiny hiccup along that California Trail where Hastings told these families to take a shortcut, and you can't see me, but I'm using air quotes. So today it's known as Hastings Cutoff, and it was supposed to save them a month. It ends up costing them an extra month. There was a time period where they went through this Great Salt Lake Desert, and for 5 days they had no water. He didn't warn them about this, so they had no water. There were no places to stop as there were along the California Trail, and some of the people got really sick. They didn't lose anybody, but they were truly dying of thirst. And at the very last minute, finally they found a water hole and they were saved. But there was no path there, and they had to cut every foot that they step every step that they took. They had to cut that path for themselves. But it's one of those cases where you work and you work and you work to clear a path, and at the end of the day you realize that you have only gone a couple miles. But okay, did you do all that work for absolutely nothing? Should you turn back? By the time they realize, you know what, we probably should turn back, they were too far into the cutoff. It would have been even more time wasted, and so they just kept going and going and going, which was a really bad decision. And so they're traveling and they're traveling and traveling. And then on Halloween night, George Donner had some more really bad luck. His front axle on his wagon broke. And so he's frantically trying to fix it. They can smell snow in the air. They're trying to fix it. And George ends up cutting his hand really bad. And so the two brothers, the Donner brothers, tell all the other families, you guys go on ahead. We're going to make camp here. We'll fix it in the morning, but we don't want to hold you guys up. Go cross the Sierra Nevadas, go through the cutoff. Do not wait for us. So the rest of the people travel onwards, and when they get to the base of the cutoff that's going to take them through the Sierra Nevadas, right at the base of that path, they decide that they're going to stay put and they're going to wait for the Donner family to catch up. And so they ended up waiting for 4 days. So the Donner family thought that they were already gone. They were not. And so finally, the group at the base of this cut at the base of this pass said, "You know what? We have to leave first thing in the morning. We can't wait for the Donners anymore." And so they go to bed that night thinking in the morning they're going to set off to cross the Sierra Nevadas. And guess what? That night there was a huge snowstorm, and that was it. The Sierra Nevada path was completely covered in snow. There was no way to cross it, and they were all going to be stuck there. And don't forget, the Donners do not know that the Reeds and the Breens and the Murphys didn't cross the mountains. The Donners think they are alone. So keep that in mind as I tell you the rest of the story. So here we have a picture of the two different camps. Now, thank goodness for the Reeds and the people that were with them. There were actually cabins, and this was a sketch that somebody did. There were actual cabins at the base of that path to cross the Sierra Nevada. So during this horrific storm and for the weeks and weeks afterwards, they at least have a shelter already made for them that they can go into. The Donners did not. The Donners had to build a tent of anything that they could find. They ended up cutting some trees and building kind of a lean-to where they put anything that they could on top of them to build this makeshift little hut for all of them to stay in. And if you look at the picture at the bottom here, see where those trees are cut off? Those trees were cut off where the snow started. So in one night, that's how deep that snow got. How they survived, I'll never know. I mean, I can't even fathom it. But the snow was as deep as the trees that you see there. So they cut off the tops of them and made themselves a little bit of a lean to. So remember, all this happened on October 31st. So by December 17th, these people are running out of rations. They're starting to get desperate. And so the Reed group that had gone ahead, they decide they've got to do something. So a group of 15 people, they were nicknamed the Forlorn Hope, on December 17th decided to set out to get help. And so you see here the group was made of 5 women, 9 men, and a 12-year-old boy. It was the healthiest people in the group. They were led by a man by the name of William Eddy. And they only took 6 days worth of food with them, knowing it was not going to be enough, but they didn't want to leave the people behind with nothing. And so they took as little as they possibly could. Two more people beyond these 15 decided they were going to go get the Donners. They were going to go back, finally, after all this time, they were going to go back and get the Donners. They never saw those two people again. We have no idea what happened to them. But this group is finally deciding to do something is what's most important. So let's find out what happened to the Forlorn Hope. On December 26th, they were completely running out of food. And there had been talk of actually holding a lottery, and they were going to pull straws, and whoever got the short straw, they were going to kill that person so the rest of the people could eat them. William Eddy would not let it happen, said no. Well, it just so happened December 26th, everybody went to sleep and one of them died in the middle of the night. And so when they got up in the morning, they ate them. They ate the person who had died. Well, there were two Indians, don't know their names, but there were two Indians in the 15, among these 15 people, and they got scared. Okay, if they're starting to eat people, we're going to be next. We're Indians. White people don't like Indians. And so these two Indians decide to leave the group. So nobody knows what happens to them until January 9th. January 9th, they come across the two Indians. They're nearly frozen to death. And guess what? They do kill them and they do eat them. So the Indians were right. It's the only case of actual murder that we are positive about, among all these people, the Donners, the Reeds, or any of the other families. It's the only case of actual murder. There was also the 12-year-old boy died too, and they ate him. At one point, they had 4 dead bodies all there together, and they decided that they wouldn't eat anybody that was related to anybody that was going to do the eating. And so they had to kind of make some choices there, who to eat and who to bury. What a horrible, horrible decision to have to make. But all in all, these people try to get through these mountains and off the mountains for 33 days. Remember, they started out with 6 days worth of food. By the time that they reached a settlement, there were only 7 of them left intact. And so they finally got a hold of somebody and told the story, and now a rescue party will finally be formed. So you're talking, they left on December 17th. 33 days later, a group will finally start forming to come in and rescue these people. But now they're going to have to make their way back to them. It's going to be a long time before anybody sees any help. So once Eddy and the other 6 of the Forlorn Hope got back to civilization, people did realize the party was missing and tried to form rescue groups. But the problem was that would normally be left for the military, and the military was busy. We were fighting the Mexican American War. So an immediate response is not going to happen. William Eddy finally gets tired of waiting, and so he forms rescue parties, 4 of them, in fact, between February and April of 1847. So he goes back 4 times, and of course, they started with they couldn't get the whole group, anybody that was surviving. They couldn't get them all at once. So he went back to his camp where the Reeds and the other families have been camping and got them first. And so the Donner camp will be the last one that is rescued. So I'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, Eddy ends up losing his entire family. By the time that he got back to their cabin, his wife and both of his children were dead. They did find a one male survivor, and this guy's name is Louis Keseberg. And Louis actually walked up to Eddy and said, "I'm really sorry, I ate your son." So we don't know if he was maybe having some kind of I don't know, a breakdown, or did he really? There was a pot of flesh that they found burning on Keseberg's fire, but they, for some reason, thought that maybe it was a woman that had gone missing and we never did find her. But there was no proof that he really did eat anybody. But anyway, Eddie swore that he was going to bring Louis Keseberg down and ruin his life. And I'll get to a little bit more to about Keseberg in a minute, but it is also thought maybe perhaps that he also killed and ate George Donner. So there was all kinds of stories about what this Keseberg did. Probably because he was, when they found him, he was surrounded by a lot of carnage, dead bodies everywhere. And so it seemed likely that he had actually killed some of them. If not killed, then at least ate some of them. Both Donner brothers end up dying, and George was just within days of rescue. He just had died, and whether Lewis ate him or not, who knows? But both their wives were gone. Four kids between the two of them. Now the Reeds will take all the rest of the Donner children and raise them in a very loving home. So at least they had a place to go. But in total, out of those 89 people, 48 of them will survive. That's astronomical. Other than the Forlorn Hope, once they all made it back to civilization, nobody else, including Keseberg, would would admit that they had committed cannibalism, except there was a little girl by the name of by the name of Mary Donner, and her father was Jacob Donner. She was 7 years old when this happened, and she swore that she remembered them chopping up and eating her dad, and that she was forced to eat her father. All the adults said that was not true. That was just a child making up a story. So we don't really know to the what extent of cannibalism there was, because even Keseberg withdrew his admittance of it. All the adults said it never really happened, except for those among the forlorn hope. So who knows? But here, let's go to the next slide, and I want to tell you a little bit more about Keseberg. So this is a picture of an actual newspaper article, and he was called the Cannibal of Donner Pass. And so Keseberg, again, he said to Eddie, "I'm sorry I ate your son. Can you please forgive me?" He's surrounded by dead bodies. There was evidence there to indicate that he possibly could have eaten George, if not killed and eaten George, just days before rescue. But that wasn't all of it that made him a real villain. If it had just been that, it might have been harder to convince people, but there were rumors of him doing nasty things along the trip before they even broke down. For instance, there was an elderly man that had paid Keseberg extra money on the trip to be allowed to ride in one of Keseberg's wagons because he had trouble walking. And at one point, Keseberg said, "Well, we're far enough along that you're going to have to come with us. You're going to have to, like, you have no choice, so get out of my wagon." So he only allowed him to ride as long as he had to keep the guy's money. There also, after all of this went through, he tried to sue the state of California, or the people of California, for not coming to rescue them quicker. And so, you can pretty much sue whoever you want. And so the judge had to hear the case. And at the end, he said, "All right, I tell you what, you win. We didn't rescue you early enough. I'm going to grant you $1. That's what you win, but you owe me $5 for court fees." So no one liked this man. He was the last person that they found. And so it is, nobody really knows exactly what happened, and it just, the way that he was and the nastiness that he did made him probably a bigger villain than he actually was. It was, a lot of it was circumstance, but he was a jerk. And of course, it's not all going to be about the one bad guy. There's heroes made in this story too. William Eddy, definitely. So when he died in 1877 as the guy who put together the Forlorn Hope, he lived, he got them help, he came back 4 times by himself, or he didn't come by himself, but he's the one that got people to come 4 times. So when he died, of course, they made a gravestone with a bronze medallion for heroism embedded in it, and a stone from Donner Lake, and it's a tourist attraction today. today. But there was another man that we don't talk about a lot, and his name was John Stark. And he went on one of these 4 trips, and the men that he was with, including Eddie, said, we've got as many people as we can. Remember, there were 40 people that were under the age or over half of the people were under the age of 40. So you've got a lot of kids. And they said, we have enough. We're headed back. And John Stark said, I can't leave all these children. So there were still 11 kids left in the camp. He said, I can't go. And all the other men on the rescue party said, well, we're leaving. Sorry. So John Stark didn't have a horse for 11 children. And so what he did is he carried those children 2 at a time. He would carry them like a quarter of a mile, put them down, go back and get 2 more, carry them for a quarter of a mile, and he leapfrogged like that until he got those children to safety. He was definitely a hero, and I love this quote: "Nobody but God and Stark and the Virgin Mary." So these are like the best spirits or entities that you can ever think of. And John Stark was right in the middle of God and the Virgin Mary. So he definitely was a hero for what he did. Doesn't look like a big, strong guy here, does he? But John Stark, hero, especially to the children. So today, of course, the Donner Camp is a huge tourist attraction. It became that during the gold rush. And if you ever want to go through the Donner Pass, you definitely see this. So pretty neat place to go. So now you have the Oregon Territory, the Oregon Trail. You know how people got across to California, but we still don't know how we got the Mexican Cession or the Gadsden Purchase. So let's get this unit done. All right, so go back to James Polk. We already know he got us Texas, and we know that he kicked Britain out of the Oregon Territory with a 54-40 fight. But that's not it. I told you he got more land than any other president. So Polk annexes Texas, right? And of course, Mexico's really, really upset. 1845. I guess they always thought they would somehow get it back. Now they're not going to because, hey, it's part of America. So immediately, Santa Anna, he's still the guy in charge, starts a boundary dispute between Mexico and America. So is it the Nesis River? According to him, it is. Or is it going to be the Rio Grande, which is where America says it is? It's 250 miles apart. That's a lot of land. And so Polk wants to be nice, and not go to war. And so he ends up going to sending a representative, sorry, to talk to Santa Anna to buy it. It's actually the disputed area and a part of California. He wants to buy it, and Santa Anna refuses to even see the representative. So that is not going to sit well with the mighty James Polk. So President Polk says, you know what? Santa Anna won't let me buy it. I'm going to take it. So he sends Zachary Taylor to the disputed territory and says, look, stay on this side of the Rio Grande. Okay. Don't cross it. Don't go into territory that we absolutely know is Mexico's. But I want you to stand on the shore of the Rio Grande on the American side, and I want you to make fun of the Mexican soldiers. Do whatever you got to do. I don't care if you tell how fat is your mama jokes. Do whatever you've got to do to make the Mexican military as mad at you as possible so they will actually fire on you. And when they do, don't fire back. Run. So that's exactly what they do. So of course the Mexican guys get upset when these American guys start making fun of them and their mothers and whatever else they can come up with. And so of course they do fire on them, and one little guy got a little scratch. One little scratch. But guess what? He was shot. It's a scratch, but he was shot by the enemy Mexico. And so Polk sends out this phrase for the very first time, and it will be used again and again every time somebody does something to us. American blood has been shed on American soil. Americans do not put up with that. 9/11, you heard that every 5 minutes on the news. American blood, American soil. That started with Polk. So immediately, when that reaches the ears of Polk, Polk puts it in every newspaper that he can across America. He takes it to Congress. I want to go to war. You're the only one that can declare it. It's 1846. The Senate votes. It's 40 to 2. The House is 174 to 14. Guess what? We are going to war with Mexico. So it's only a 2 year war, pretty easy. And they set out right away with this three-prong attack plan. It went like butter. So attack Mexican forces guarding the Rio Grande. One group of American military will do that, and these are Marines. Capture Santa Fe, cut down. That will stop all the trade coming into the Mexican territory. It's the most important trading center. And third, most important, capture Mexico City, the capital of Mexico. And again, this is Marines. So I hope that I can get this to work. I'm going to try and insert a little clip from the Marine Corps song from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli.
From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we fight our country's battles in the air, on land and sea. First to fight for right and freedom, and to keep our honor clean. We are proud to claim the title of United States Army. Our flags unfurled to every breeze, from dawn to setting sun. We have fought in every clime and place where we could take a gun. In the snow of far-off northern lands and in sunny tropic seas, you will find us always on the job, the United States Marine. Here's health to you and to our corps, which we are proud to serve. In many a strife we fought for life and never lost our nerve. If the Army and the Navy ever look on heaven's seas, they will find the streets are guarded by United States Marines.
So this is what they're talking about. Our military guys, our Marines, actually walked the halls of Montezuma. Montezuma, the most evil of all the Aztecs rulers. You should know him. So that's where we get the song, the Marine Corps song from. The halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Remember Thomas Jefferson and the Barbary pirates? They met at Tripoli. Okay, you're probably sitting there going, I don't really care. Just tell us the rest of the story. Anyway, with that three-prong attack, all three prongs being super, super successful, the Mexican government begins to collapse, and Santa Anna is screaming for a treaty. And here's the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. I love saying that. Can you tell? So the disputed territory between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River is granted to us, of course. We also actually paid some money here, believe it or not. We paid $15 million, but look what we got. California, Utah, Nevada, most of New Mexico, and most of Arizona, parts of Colorado, parts of Wyoming. Holy crap. 7 states, 7 states. And that whole area that you see in the picture right here is called the Mexican Cession. It should actually say the Mexican area we stole from the Mexicans. We really, really did steal this. We really did. $15 million, come on. But anyway, we got 7 states out of it. And don't forget 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848. Remember that from last year. That's the year that the whole world was going to hell. Revolutions everywhere. Women want the right to vote for the first time. The gold rush is about to happen. Crazy, crazy, crazy stuff. 1848. So, one more time, make sure you know what area is the Mexican Cession. Here it is for you, black and white. So, what is the significance of the Mexican American War? Of course, it increases the United States by more than a third. That's super significant, even if we did steal it. It does lead to intense sectionalism, not really over the ideology of slavery, but the right for a state to choose whether they are a slave state or a free state. Remember, the whole war is going to be about states' rights, not slavery, states' rights. And a lot of the states' rights has to do with money and taxes. But here's another example. We should be able to choose as a state. And of course, that's not going to always happen. So, a lot of people say the Mexican American War was a training ground for the Civil War. It was going to draw that final line. Who knows? One of the things about this being such a short war and everything going so according to plan is some historians say that the win was just too easy, that America got really big for her britches. And that is one reason that the South was confident enough to fight the North, because it was such an easy win and everybody involved thought, they were just the best military minds ever. And maybe it did give the South enough confidence to say, we can actually succeed and fight a war and win. So who knows? I mean, you can never tell about those kind of things. Because it's the same time period, I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead a little bit, and talk about California and how we ended up making California a state. We will talk about that again in the next unit, but I want to kind of set the stage here. So it's 1848. It's right before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Sorry, Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed, and a poor little dude finds a rock of gold at a place called Sutter's Mill. And of course, word gets out overnight that gold is in California, and the rush begins by 1849. 1849. In that time period, that is overnight. 1848, it took them a year to figure out there was gold there. That's pretty daggone fast with no internet and no newspapers in most places. But anyway, we call the gold mining people, that rush of people, the miner 49ers. And that's because the big rush will take place in 1849. Just in that year alone, 100,000 people rushed into California, and so it becomes the gold rush. California becomes a horrible place. There's no one in charge. These towns, these gold towns, come up and fall down overnight. Literally, people just are able to do whatever they want to do because nobody's in charge. And you're talking about money. So if somebody finds out that you found gold, you think they're not going to kill you in your sleep, or maybe even when you're awake to get your land. I mean, nobody is saying whose land is whose. It's just completely lawless. And so California begs the Union to please make them a state, and it is granted in 1850. So it's granted very quickly in order to settle the place down and to be able to claim the taxes on that gold. It's always about money. So just to kind of give you an idea, 7 years from the year that they found gold, 1848, within 7 years, 300,000 people made their way to California, and $2 billion in gold was dug out of the earth. So that should give you kind of a picture of the lawlessness of it. Even after they become a state, it's still going to be a pretty bad place to be. So we have everything here on the map now except for that pesky little 1853 Gadsden Purchase. So we're almost done. Hang in there with me. I know you're tired of hearing me talk, but we're almost there. So Gadsden Purchase. Today, see here on the map, it is southern Arizona and New Mexico. So President Pierce, we're done with Polk. President Pierce sends a man by the name of James Gadsden to deal with Santa Anna. Yes, he's still alive. And Gadsden says to Santa Anna, can we please buy this? I know you hate us, but we paid 15 million for all that land that we got from you. We're willing to pay you $10 million for this little tiny section. So the plan was for the United States to run the Transcontinental Railroad through this territory. The problem is Polk or Pierce or nobody else ever thought to send somebody down to check the area out to see if we could build a railroad there. And guess what? We couldn't. It is a horrible place. It's very mountainous. There's no way to put a train line in there. And Santa Anna knew it. So, sure, he took our $10 million and handed the Gadsden Purchase right over to America, laughing on the inside as hard as he could. But it does end up being a safety net from invasion in the South. So, it kind of was sort of maybe worth it because people were not going to come out of Mexico and cross the Gadsden territory to invade Arizona, New Mexico, or California. It was just too rough. They weren't going to. So it did give us a safety net during the time period when we had to worry about Mexico. Today, that is actually an area that some people try to cross through illegally because it is so tough. So it's still a tough place, but definitely never putting a railroad through there. So Santa Ana finally got one over on the United States. Okay, so you finally should know where we got all these different territories on the map. So if you know them, know the little secrets to each story, you're going to do great on the test. And hopefully, I've given you a good foundation before we move on to the next unit, where we get into some serious sectionalism and start preparing for the Civil War. So talk at you soon, little boys and girls.